going to take you back to the main story, of course, here on France 24 now, that murder of that priest near Rouen, in a suburb of Rouen. Of course, the French papers once again digesting not another terrorist attack, that horrific attack on the priest in Normandy. Diptyque Laurent is with us.
Well, the shock is resounding in the French papers. You really see that in the front pages, Stuart. We're here once again, left to pick up the pieces of yet another terror attack. Let's look at some of those headlines. Horror in the church. Horreur à l'office, says L'Humanité on its front page of the communist paper, while the right-wing publication L'Opinion has a one-word headline: impuissance, powerlessness to do anything about it, really referring to the government, but also society as a whole. What can we do to prevent these attacks?
Now, here in France, we actually have a daily French Catholic newspaper. It's called Le Croix. Presumably you've heard of it, because we do talk about it a lot here on France 24, but a lot of emotional reaction in there, Dipty.
Yeah, especially from La Croix, of course, being the Catholic paper of reference. On its front page, it says, face au mal, confront the evil. Now, the paper has actually penned a very passionate, very moving editorial on its front page in reaction to yesterday's attack. The piece is inspired by the words of the Archbishop of Rouen, who said, "I scream towards God." For La Croix, it's a scream of pain, of helplessness in the face of this very barbaric crime. But it's also a scream of anger at the fanatic violence that's sort of bloodying this world, our world, that we've seen at least in the last couple of months. But La Croix says it's also a call for help, that we shouldn't give in to the temptation of revenge.
Dipsy, you've been looking as well at some of the reaction on the internet. Lots of users are actually sharing a passage considered to be one of the most spiritual texts of the 20th century.
That's right, Stuart. That text is from Christian de Chergé. He was a monk killed alongside 6 of his compatriots in Tiberine in Algeria during the country's civil war. That year was 1996. You might remember him, or our viewers might remember him, because it inspired a film in 2010. Now, I'd like to read a part of that text in which he says, I quote, "If one day I become a victim of terrorism, I would like that my community, my church, my family accept that this is God's fate, and not just to mourn my death, but that of so many others left in the indifference of anonymity." Now, that sort of humble spirit really certainly embodied Father Jacques as well.
Yeah, very poignant words there. Now, of course, it's not just the Catholic community who are in mourning here in France. It's all of France, irrespective as well of religion.
That's right. Father Jacques was a, quote, tireless priest. That's what L'Humanité says. He fought for religious cohabitation. L'Humanité actually reminds readers of the fact that Father Jacques was part of a multi-faith community, which included the imam of the mosque of Saint-Étienne de Rouvray, that city where the attack took place. And in fact, the mosque was built in 2000 on a block of land given by the parish. Now, for Le Figaro, the right-leaning paper, the priest was assassinated by barbarians, I quote there. The paper says that the church is a place of worship, gathering for Christians, but it's also a familiar symbol for most French people, if not all French people, because pretty much in every city or village where you go, there's always a church, even though France is a secular country. Now, for Le Figaro, it's clear that it's not just Catholics who are targeted, but all of France. And the paper is urging the government to, quote, confront the evil, name the evil, condemn it, but also at the same time beef up the military, defense, police, legal resources to ensure that we can protect ourselves.
Indeed, of course, the French government, and in particular François Hollande himself, under fire from opposition parties, but also from citizens in general, since the Nice attack already, barely just 2 weeks ago, of course.
That's right. It's really crazy to imagine that it was not even 2 weeks ago, and yet so much has happened, Stuart. It's an election year, of course, so François Hollande is already embattled, so it's opposition parties are ganging up on him for political gain, it has to be said, but we're seeing this sort of exasperation that we saw perhaps just before the Nice attacks translate into something more belligerent. For instance, Alain Juppé, who's presidential candidate on the right, he's quoted by Le Parisien as saying, "This terror should not even have happened." He calls on French people to band together against these, quote, barbarians. Again, this word we're seeing a lot this morning. And he calls for a, quote, counterattack that's faultless and without weakness. Now, on the far right, Marine Le Pen's party has come down hard on Hollande and for what it calls the government's inaction.
The same with Libération. They've published a very rousing editorial today.
Libé's message is very clear. Its headline says, "Don't give in, ne rien céder." It's a very bold headline there, accompanied by a photo of a police officer. Now, in its editorial, Libé reminds readers that since March 2012, that was the attack in Toulouse by Mohamed Merah, countless children, adults, Muslims, Jews, Christians, but also atheists, thinking of the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists, revelers, policemen, soldiers have died in France in numerous terror attacks. And we have this impression now that we're sort of being dragged into a war that we didn't want any part of, but we're sort of in it now and we have to fight it. Libération says, though, terrorism will never succeed in destroying our lifestyle, what we stand for, our country, our constitution. So it's a very positive, sort of uplifting editorial, if you like. And at the same time, the paper criticizes this political reaction, saying, in the end, we're our worst enemy, our impatience, our irresponsibility in thinking that we can erode our rights in order to fight terrorism. And finally, Libé says, this is not a war against France, it's a war against freedom.
Don't give in. Good words there from Libération. Thank you very much, Dipti. Dipti looking at the French papers. We're going to end